The Durrel House loomed like a malignant shadow at the edge of town, its presence heavy with a darkness that seemed to seep into the very air around it. It stood, abandoned yet eerily alive, a monolith of terror that had claimed countless souls over the years. The town's children whispered tales of the devil residing within, of dark rituals and cursed bloodlines. But these were just stories, until the disappearances began again. The secret government team, known only as Black Watch, had been assembled in response to the resurgence of sinister activity around the house. Led by Captain Sarah Blake, a hardened soldier with no time for superstition, the team was a collection of the best in their fields. Marcus, a tech savant with a flair for the paranormal, Dr. Evelyn Pierce, a psychic with a haunted past, and Logan, an exorcist who had seen too much in his lifetime. As they approached the Durrel House, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that made the house appear to stretch out, as if it was reaching for them. Blake felt an involuntary shiver run down her spine. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Marcus began setting up his equipment, EMF readers, thermal cameras, and motion sensors. The house was silent, too silent, as if holding its breath. The team cautiously entered, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. The interior was a mausoleum of forgotten horrors. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the faint scent of something foul, like decaying flesh, permeated the air. Dr. Pierce paused, her eyes glazing over as she touched the wall. "I can feel them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here, watching us." Logan crossed himself, the unease growing with every step they took deeper into the house. They reached the foyer, where a grand staircase led to the second floor. It was here that the first attack came, a blur of movement from the shadows. A skinwalker, its body contorted and wrong, leapt at Marcus, its claws tearing through his shoulder. He screamed, the sound echoing through the house as blood splattered the walls. Blake fired her weapon, the bullets ripping into the creature, but it only hissed, an unearthly sound that made their blood run cold. It retreated into the darkness, leaving Marcus writhing in pain on the floor. The team quickly moved to stabilize him, but the wound was deep, too deep. Blood pooled around him as his breath became ragged. "We need to get out of here," Logan shouted, but the house had other plans. The doors slammed shut, locking them in. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and they could hear the scratching of claws on wood, the low growl of something inhuman. The house was alive, and it had them now. Panic set in as the team realized the gravity of their situation. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. Marcus lay on the floor, his breathing shallow. His skin pale as blood continued to seep from the deep gashes on his shoulder. Blake knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she applied pressure to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Logan, we need to get him out of here." Blake's voice was laced with urgency, but Logan was already one step ahead, searching for any exit, any way out. But the house seemed to be shifting, the walls subtly moving, twisting the corridors into a labyrinth. Dr. Pierce, her eyes wide with terror, muttered incantations under her breath, hoping to ward off whatever malevolent force was stalking them. But her connection to the house was growing stronger, and with it, the visions came, a rush of violent images flashing through her mind. She saw the previous victims, their tortured faces, and the figure in the shadows, the one pulling the strings, orchestrating their doom. "They're coming for us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of noises. Scratching, whispering, the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. Blake barked orders, trying to maintain control, but it was clear the house had the upper hand. The sound of something dragging across the floor echoed through the foyer, and then they saw it, Marcus's body being pulled, as if by invisible hands, towards the basement door. "No!" Blake lunged, grabbing his arm, but the force was too strong. She was thrown back as the basement door creaked open, revealing only pitch blackness below. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, but they were vacant, his soul already claimed by whatever horror resided within the depths of the house. Dr. Pierce screamed as Marcus's body was dragged down the stairs, disappearing into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made their hearts drop. The house had claimed its first sacrifice. Logan, pale and shaken, crossed himself again. "We need to go after him," he said, but even he knew it was a futile gesture. Whatever had taken Marcus was far beyond their ability to save him. Blake forced herself to stand, her resolve hardening. "We don't leave anyone behind. We go in, we find him, and we get out of this godforsaken place." The team, though terrified, nodded in agreement. They had come here to face the unknown, and now there was no turning back. But as they descended the stairs into the basement, it became clear that they were walking into the heart of darkness itself, and the house was far from done with them. The air grew colder, the walls seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and the only light was the faint glow of their flashlights, barely penetrating the inky blackness. The deeper they went, the more they felt the presence of something ancient, something evil, watching them, waiting for its next move. And they knew there would be more blood. The basement of the Durrel house was nothing like they had expected. The stairs creaked ominously under their weight, the darkness thick and oppressive, swallowing the narrow beams of their flashlights. The air was damp and carried the stench of decay, like something rotting deep within the earth. As they reached the bottom, it became clear that the basement was far larger than it should have been, almost as if it existed in a different dimension altogether. The walls were lined with ancient stone, covered in strange symbols and markings that none of them recognized. The temperature had dropped even further, their breath visible in the dim light. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and into their bones, disorienting them as they struggled to make sense of the space. "Stay close," Blake ordered, her voice shaky but firm. She glanced at Dr. Pierce, who seemed to be in a trance, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the walls. Pierce, snap out of it. But Dr. Pierce was lost to the visions flooding her mind. She saw blood, so much blood, and the faces of the damned, twisted in agony. She could hear their screams, feel their pain, and the overwhelming presence of something ancient and malevolent that had been feeding on the souls of the innocent for centuries. "We're not alone down here," Logan whispered, his voice trembling. He could feel it too, an evil so profound that it seemed to seep into his very soul, corrupting everything it touched. He gripped his cross tightly, praying silently for protection. Suddenly, the walls seemed to move, shifting and closing in around them. The hum grew louder, turning into a deafening roar. They were surrounded by shadows, but these were not mere tricks of the light. The shadows moved with purpose, slithering along the floor and walls, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that seemed almost alive. Then they saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, a grotesque amalgamation of human and beast. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, its body twisted and malformed. It was neither crawler nor skinwalker, but something much worse, a demon from the depths of hell, conjured by the dark rituals that had been performed in this house. Blake fired her weapon, but the bullets passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. It laughed, a sound that chilled them to the bone, and lunged at them with inhuman speed. Logan raised his cross, but the creature swatted it away as if it were nothing. It was upon them in an instant, its claws slicing through flesh with ease. Blood sprayed across the walls as it tore into them, their screams echoing through the cavernous space. Dr. Pierce was the first to fall, her body crumpling to the floor, lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. The creature turned its gaze to Blake, a twisted smile spreading across its face as it advanced on her. But before it could strike, a blinding light filled the room, forcing the creature to retreat back into the shadows with a shriek of rage. The light faded, revealing a hidden passageway that had not been there before, leading deeper into the earth. Blake, covered in blood and trembling with fear, knew they had no choice but to press on. The house had drawn them into its lair, and there was no escaping now. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, a narrow tunnel carved from the stone itself. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sickeningly sweet blood. The walls were slick with moisture, and the floor uneven, making every step a precarious one. The hum that had filled the basement was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. Blake led the way, her flashlight barely penetrating the darkness ahead. Logan followed closely behind, clutching his cross as if it were his last hope. They were the last two left, the others either dead or lost to the house, and the weight of that realization pressed down on them like a vice. "Do you hear that?" Logan's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes darting around the tunnel, as if expecting something to jump out at them at any moment. Blake paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the distant cries of someone in agony. It was coming from deeper within the tunnel, and it made her skin crawl. "We have to keep moving," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Whatever's down there, we need to face it." They continued down the tunnel, the cries growing louder with each step. The walls began to change, the rough stone giving way to smooth surfaces covered in more of the strange symbols they had seen earlier. The temperature dropped even further, their breath now visible in the cold air. Then they reached the end of the tunnel, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The passage opened up into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one containing a body, mummified and decayed, their faces twisted in eternal torment. The floor was littered with bones, the remains of those who had been sacrificed to whatever dark entity resided in this place. But it was the centerpiece of the chamber that drew their attention, a massive stone altar, stained with the blood of countless victims. Chains hung from the ceiling, and the floor around the altar was slick with fresh blood. And standing before the altar was a figure, cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You've come at last," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber. "I've been waiting for you." Blake raised her weapon, but the figure merely laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You cannot kill what is already dead," it said, and with a wave of its hand, the chamber came alive. The mummified bodies began to move, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light as the figures. They clawed their way out of the alcoves, their skeletal fingers reaching for the intruders. Blake and Logan backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The figure raised its hands, and the ground beneath them began to shake. The altar split open, revealing a pit of fire and darkness, from which emerged creatures that defied description. Skinwalkers, crawlers, demons, all twisted and deformed, their eyes filled with malice and hunger. The chamber was filled with the sounds of screams and tearing flesh as the creatures descended upon them. Logan was the first to fall, his body ripped apart by the demonic horde. Blake fought with everything she had, but it was no use. The darkness consumed her, the last thing she saw being the figure's glowing eyes, watching with satisfaction as she was dragged into the pit. The Durrel House had claimed its victims, but the evil within was far from sated. Night had fallen over the Durrel House, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The once grand mansion now stood as a dark silhouette against the starless sky, a beacon of malevolence in the middle of nowhere. Inside, the few remaining investigators huddled together in the living room, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and a cold draft seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "This place is alive," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. She was the team's tech specialist, but no amount of equipment could save them from the horrors they had encountered. "It's like it's watching us." "Not just watching," said Victor, a seasoned paranormal investigator who had seen his fair share of hauntings. But this was different. The Durrel House wasn't just haunted, it was possessed, and it was hungry. "It's toying with us." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, causing everyone to jump. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls. The investigators exchanged terrified glances. The house wasn't just toying with them, it was hunting them. "We need to leave," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "Now, before it's too late." But as they tried to make their way to the front door, the walls began to close in around them, the hallway stretching and twisting into a maze of corridors that seemed to defy logic. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in a chorus of madness, each one speaking of death, pain, and despair. Victor led the way, his flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, the symbols etched into the wood glowing with an eerie light. They passed doors that led to nowhere, each one slamming shut as they approached. The air grew colder, their breath coming out in visible puffs. "Keep moving," Victor shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the screams that suddenly erupted from the walls. Faces began to emerge from the wood, twisted and grotesque, their mouths open in silent cries of agony. They were the souls of those who had been trapped here, their torment eternal. Jenna screamed as one of the faces lunged at her, its eyes burning with a fiery rage. She stumbled back, tripping over a loose floorboard and falling hard. Victor reached out to help her, but the floor beneath her gave way, and she was swallowed by the darkness below. "Jenna!" Victor yelled, but it was too late. She was gone, lost to the house. The walls began to close in even further, the floor shifting beneath their feet. They were being herded, driven towards something waiting for them in the heart of the house. The whispers grew louder, becoming a deafening roar that threatened to drive them insane. Victor knew they were being led to their deaths, but there was no other choice but to follow the path laid out before them. The house was in control now, and it would not be satisfied until every last one of them was consumed. Victor and the remaining survivors found themselves at the end of the hallway, standing before a massive, ancient door that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The door was covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the walls, but these were different, more sinister, more powerful. The wood was blackened and charred, as if it had been scorched by flames from the deepest pits of hell. "This is it," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever is behind this door is the source of all the evil in this house." One of the team members, a young psychic named Sarah, trembled as she placed her hand on the door. It's like it's alive," she said, pulling her hand back as if burned. "There's something behind here, something ancient and hungry." Without warning, the door swung open on its own, revealing a staircase leading down into the pitch-black depths of the house. The air that wafted up from below was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the temperature dropped even further, making their skin prickle with cold sweat. "We have to go down," Victor said, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn and run. But there was no other way out. The house had them trapped, and this was the only path left. The staircase seemed to descend forever, the walls closing in tighter with each step. The darkness was absolute, their flashlights barely penetrating it, as if the shadows themselves were alive and absorbing the light. The whispers were back, but now they were clearer, more distinct, each voice speaking directly to their fears, their regrets, their deepest, darkest secrets. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a vast, underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding jars filled with grotesque specimens, severed limbs, rotting organs, and twisted fetuses that seemed to twitch and move within their glass prisons. The floor was slick with blood, and in the center of the chamber stood a large stone altar, much like the one in the basement, but this one was different. It was stained with fresh blood, and the air around it crackled with dark energy. And then they saw it, a figure standing behind the altar, cloaked in shadow. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in sharp, talon-like claws. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. "You've come at last," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural growl that echoed through the chamber. "I've been waiting for you." The figure raised its arms, and the shadows in the chamber came to life, twisting and writhing as they took on forms. Skinwalkers, crawlers, demons, all with glowing eyes and mouths dripping with blood. They advanced on the group, moving with unnatural speed, their claws slicing through the air. The chamber was filled with the sounds of screams and tearing flesh as the creatures descended upon them. Sarah was the first to fall, her body ripped apart by the demonic horde. Victor fought with everything he had, but it was no use. The darkness closed in around him, and the last thing he saw was the figure's glowing eyes, watching with satisfaction as he was dragged into the abyss. The air inside the chamber grew thick with the stench of death as the darkness swirled around the survivors like a living thing. Victor's screams had faded into silence, leaving just Dana, the group's occult expert, and Greg, the ex-military team member, alive and trembling. Their flashlights flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely penetrated the oppressive blackness. "We need to get out of here," Greg whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. But as he spoke, the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing them inside. Dana's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for any sign of an escape. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolence, the shadows reaching out like fingers, beckoning them closer to the altar. The stone slab was now drenched in blood, the thick crimson liquid seeping into the floor and forming a grotesque pattern that glowed with an unholy light. "This isn't just a haunted house," Dana muttered, more to herself than to Greg. "This place, it's a gateway, a portal to something far worse." Greg nodded, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "Whatever it is, we need to shut it down." Now, as they edged closer to the altar, the shadows began to take shape again, forming grotesque figures that leered at them from the darkness. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their mouths opening in silent screams. One of the shadows lunged at Dana, its clawed hands swiping at her face. She screamed and stumbled back, barely avoiding its grasp. "We have to fight," Greg shouted, swinging his flashlight at the shadowy figure. The beam of light struck the creature, and it hissed, retreating into the darkness. "The light hurts them." But even as he spoke, more shadows emerged from the walls, their forms becoming more solid, more tangible. These were no longer just ghosts or spirits. They were something far worse, creatures from the deepest pits of hell. Skinwalkers, crawlers, and demonic figures surrounded them, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Dana grabbed a canister of salt from her bag, an old trick for warding off evil spirits, and tossed it at one of the creatures. The salt sizzled as it hit the shadow, burning through it like acid. The creature shrieked and dissolved into the air, but more took its place, advancing on them with renewed ferocity. "This is it," Dana yelled, hurling more salt at the encroaching horde. "We have to destroy the altar. It's the source of all this." Greg didn't need to be told twice. He rushed forward, dodging the grasping hands of the shadows, and slammed his flashlight down onto the stone altar with all his might. The altar cracked, and the glowing blood that covered it began to bubble and hiss. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering as the altar's power waned. But the victory was short-lived. The chamber shook violently, and a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the walls. The ground beneath their feet began to split, revealing a gaping chasm filled with fire and writhing shadows. From the depths of the chasm rose the figure they had seen before, but now it was fully formed, its true demonic nature revealed. Horned, with wings like those of a bat, and eyes burning with the fires of hell, it towered over them, its mouth opening in a roar that shook the very foundations of the house. "You cannot stop me," the demon bellowed, its voice shaking the air. "This house is mine, and so are your souls." Dana and Greg stood frozen in terror as the demon advanced, the heat from the chasm scorching their skin. The chamber was collapsing around them, and there was no way out. They were trapped, at the mercy of the devil itself. The Durrel House groaned as if it were alive, the very walls trembling under the weight of the dark power that had been unleashed. The demon, now fully emerged from the fiery chasm, towered over Dana and Greg, its wings stretching wide, casting the chamber into an even deeper shadow. The flickering light from their failing flashlights barely illuminated its hideous form, a grotesque mix of sinew, bone, and dark magic, with eyes that glowed like embers. Greg took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The ground beneath them trembled, and the cracks in the floor widened, exposing more of the fiery abyss below. "We're going to die here," he muttered, his voice filled with despair. "Not if I can help it," Dana snapped, her mind racing. The demon was feeding off the energy of the house, growing stronger with each passing second. Destroying the altar had weakened it, but it wasn't enough. They needed to sever its connection to this world completely. Dana frantically searched her bag, pulling out a small vial of holy water and a worn, leather-bound book of exorcisms. She had never performed an exorcism herself, but she had studied enough to know what needed to be done. If they could force the demon back into the abyss, they might stand a chance of escaping with their lives. The demon snarled, sensing her intent. It raised one clawed hand, and the shadows around them surged forward, attacking with renewed fury. Greg swung his flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark figures, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. "Dana, whatever you're going to do it fast," Greg shouted, wincing as one of the shadowy creatures raked its claws across his arm, drawing blood. Dana nodded, her hands shaking as she opened the book and began to recite the exorcism. Her voice was barely audible over the roar of the flames and the hissing of the shadows, but she continued, pouring every ounce of her will into the words. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you, demon, to return to the pit from which you came," she yelled, throwing the holy water at the demon's feet. The reaction was immediate. The demon recoiled, its skin sizzling where the holy water touched it. It let out a deafening roar, its wings flapping furiously, stirring up a whirlwind of ash and embers. The shadows that had been attacking Greg faltered, their forms flickering as the power that sustained them wavered. Greg seized the moment, rushing forward to stand beside Dana. "Keep going," he urged, his voice hoarse but determined. Dana continued the exorcism, her voice growing stronger with each word. The demon thrashed in agony, its form beginning to waver, as though it were being pulled back into the chasm. The ground beneath them shook violently, the cracks widening into gaping holes that threatened to swallow them whole. With one final, desperate effort, Dana shouted the last words of the exorcism. "I banish you back to the darkness. In the name of God, be gone." The demon let out a final, ear-splitting scream as its body was engulfed in flames. The shadows around them dissipated, sucked back into the chasm as the demon was dragged down into the fiery abyss. The ground rumbled one last time before the chasm sealed shut, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Dana and Greg collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The air was still thick with the smell of sulfur and blood, but the oppressive presence that had filled the house was gone. The chamber was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant creaking of the house as it settled back into its unnatural stillness. "We did it," Greg said, his voice shaky with exhaustion. "We actually did it." But even as he spoke, Dana couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. The house might be quiet now, but it was still alive, still hungry. They needed to get out before it decided to claim them as its final victims. The silence in the dull house was deceptive. Dana and Greg, bruised and exhausted, staggered to their feet, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on them. The air was thick with the lingering smell of sulfur, and the walls seemed to close in, as though the house itself was angry at their survival. "We need to get out," Dana whispered, her voice barely audible. Greg nodded, glancing around warily. The walls were covered in peeling, faded wallpaper, and the floor creaked ominously beneath their feet. But as they turned toward the door, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the house. It was almost as if the house was breathing. The sound grew louder, resonating through the walls, until it became a cacophony of whispers. Thousands of voices, speaking in tongues, growing in intensity with every passing second. Greg and Dana covered their ears, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "Get out of my head," Greg shouted, but the voices continued to grow, a constant, throbbing presence that threatened to overwhelm them. "Greg!" Dana screamed, pointing at the walls. The wallpaper was peeling back to reveal faces, distorted and ghostly, their eyes wide with terror. The faces pressed against the walls as if they were trying to break free, their mouths opening and closing as they chanted in unison. "This place is alive," Greg muttered, his eyes wide with horror. Dana grabbed his arm. "We need to keep moving. Don't look at them, just keep going." They stumbled toward the door, but as they reached it, the floorboards gave way beneath Greg, sending him crashing down into a hidden room below. Dana screamed as he disappeared from sight, the voices in the walls shrieking with laughter. "Greg!" Dana yelled, peering down into the darkness below. But all she could see was darkness, impenetrable and suffocating. A low growl echoed up from the hole, followed by the sound of something moving in the shadows. Dana's heart pounded in her chest as she heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. She grabbed a flashlight from her bag and shone it down into the hole. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a figure moving toward Greg, who was lying unconscious on the ground. It was humanoid but twisted and deformed, with elongated limbs and a face contorted into a permanent snarl. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light as it crawled toward Greg, its jaws snapping hungrily. "Greg, wake up!" Dana screamed, but he remained motionless. The creature lunged at Greg, its claws slashing through the air. Dana screamed and threw the flashlight at the creature, hitting it squarely in the face. The creature recoiled, hissing, but quickly recovered, turning its attention to Dana. Desperate, Dana grabbed a rope from her bag and tied it to a nearby beam. She lowered herself down into the hole, her heart pounding with terror as the creature advanced on Greg. She landed with a thud and rushed to his side, shaking him frantically. "Greg, please, wake up!" she cried, but there was no response. The creature was nearly upon them, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Dana grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and held it up like a weapon, ready to fight with everything she had. But the creature was too fast, too strong. It lunged at her, knocking the wood from her hands and pinning her to the ground. Dana screamed as the creature's claws dug into her flesh, its hot breath on her face. She struggled to break free, but it was no use. The creature was too powerful. As it opened its jaws to deliver the killing blow, Dana closed her eyes, preparing for the end. But then a sudden blinding light filled the room, and the creature let out a blood-curdling scream, releasing Dana and recoiling in pain. Dana opened her eyes to see Greg standing above her, the flashlight he had recovered now shining directly at the creature. "Get up!" Greg shouted, pulling Dana to her feet. Together, they scrambled out of the hole, the creature still screaming in agony as the light burned it from within. They slammed the trapdoor shut, the voices in the walls finally fading into silence. But the danger was far from over. The walls of the Durrel house trembled with fury, the entire structure groaning as if it were about to collapse in on itself. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and sulfur, making it hard to breathe. Dana and Greg, covered in sweat and blood, staggered through the darkened hallways, searching for any way out. "This way," Greg whispered, leading Dana down a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The floor beneath them creaked with each step, and the walls were alive with shadows that twisted and writhed, as if mocking their desperation. Dana clutched her side where the creature's claws had raked her, each breath sending waves of pain through her body. But they couldn't stop. Not now. The corridor led them to a massive wooden door, its surface covered in ancient, unreadable symbols that seemed to pulse with dark energy. Greg hesitated for a moment, but the sound of the walls cracking and splitting behind them spurred him into action. He shoved the door open, and they stumbled into a large, circular room. At the center of the room stood an altar, similar to the one they had destroyed earlier, but this one was larger, more menacing. It was surrounded by candles that flickered with a sickly green flame, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Blood-red symbols were etched into the floor around the altar, forming a massive pentagram that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Dana gasped as she noticed what lay on the altar. A figure bound in chains, writhing and convulsing as though in agony. It was Victor, but his face was contorted in pain, his eyes rolling back in his head as if something was tearing him apart from the inside. Greg moved toward the altar, but Dana grabbed his arm, stopping him. "It's too late for him," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "This is the heart of the house, the source of all its power." Greg looked at her, his face pale with fear. "Then how do we stop it?" Dana swallowed hard, her mind racing. "We have to destroy the altar. If we don't, the house will keep feeding, and it will never let us leave." Greg nodded, but as they approached the altar, the air in the room grew heavy, pressing down on them like a physical force. The candles flickered wildly, and the pentagram on the floor began to glow with an intense, blinding light. A deep, guttural voice filled the room, echoing off the walls. "You cannot destroy what has been sealed in blood. This house will consume you, just as it has consumed so many before." The room began to shake violently, the walls cracking and splitting as if the house itself were trying to tear them apart. The figure on the altar let out a blood-curdling scream, its body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Dana felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the voice continued to speak, its words resonating deep within her mind. Join us. Let your souls become one with the house. There is no escape. No, Dana screamed, grabbing the flashlight and shining it at the altar. The light cut through the darkness, causing the symbols on the floor to sizzle and smoke. The voice let out a roar of fury, and the room shook even harder, pieces of the ceiling crashing down around them. "Now, Greg," Dana shouted, and together they lifted the broken wood from the floor and drove it into the center of the altar. The moment the wood struck the altar, a deafening explosion rocked the room, and a wave of searing heat blasted through the air. The pentagram on the floor ignited in flames, the fire spreading rapidly, consuming everything in its path. The figure on the altar let out one final, tortured scream before it was engulfed in the flames, and the room began to collapse around them. Greg and Dana raced for the door, barely making it through before the entire room was consumed in fire. They sprinted down the hallway, the house shaking violently, pieces of the ceiling collapsing behind them as they ran. Finally, they burst through the front door and out into the cold night air, collapsing onto the ground as the house behind them erupted in flames. The inferno lit up the sky, and as they watched, the dull house, with all its dark secrets, burned to the ground. But as they lay there, gasping for breath, they both knew that something had escaped, something dark and terrible, and it was now loose in the world.